This thing worked today? Good. I'm glad Sandy, on many occasions, can't get the sound system right. I'm glad he got it right today. Let me welcome you to the 6th Nixon Legacy Panel. We are happy today that C-SPAN is covering this event, and we welcome them. Clare Boothe Luce told President Nixon that in 1,000 years, they will say Nixon went to China. We all know that Watergate is a part of our history, but there was so much more. Not just a great foreign policy agenda, but a lesser-known domestic agenda. I think you'll be pleased to hear the panelists today talk about some of those other initiatives, legacy moments, as we like to call them. The past legacy forums have been the organization of the Domestic Policy Program, the use of the President's time, an environmental policy forum, and a forum on Watergate. Our next panel will be in September, and it's the peaceful desegregation of our southern schools, which President Nixon gets very little credit for. That'll be held here at the library. In October, the Pat Moynihan in the White House. His story has never been told, and his papers have just been processed by the National Archives. So with that, let me introduce our panel today. I'm doing it in alphabetical order, not as they are seated. Barbara Franklin, a very distinguished corporate entity at this stage, was a staff assistant to the President and led the task force to recruit women into the Nixon administration. Larry Higby was deputy assistant to the President and chief of staff for Bob Haldeman. He's also a new member of the Nixon Foundation Board. Todd Hullin was President Nixon's domestic counsel and associate director for housing and community affairs, later at the Department of Defense. Fred Malek was the man that was put in charge of presidential personnel. He was a special assistant to the President for presidential personnel, and I think most of us give him credit, as you'll hear today, for the caliber of people that were brought into the Nixon administration and then subsequently went on to many other presidents. He was also the deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget. So with that, Todd, let me start with you. And oh, Bobbie, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Actually, I should have been doing it the way I was doing it here. Bobbie Kilberg, was a White House fellow, and she was staff assistant to the President of the United States and the Domestic Council. Sorry about that, Bobbie. And with that, I'm going to ask Todd to sort of set the stage for what it was like in the fall of 1968 as we were elected.
Presidents are defined by their times. It's true in these times, and it was true in those times. And after 40-plus years, we tend to forget what it was like in 1968 during that presidential campaign. Let me just review quickly some of the issues. The Cold War was raging. The Soviet Union was the Soviet Union, not Russia. We each had thousands of warheads pointed at each other and our allies. There was tension across the world at every spot, and we felt probably that China might align with Russia should there be some kind of a conflict. It was a very tense and dangerous world, and the probability of us having an exchange frightened the entire world. The Soviets had invaded Czechoslovakia. The North Koreans had taken down a spy ship called the Pueblo in disputed waters. So this was a time with the Soviet Union and the U.S. really squaring off. Today we look at Russia as a competitor, economic competitor, more than a military threat. Vietnam was raging. There were 550,000 troops in Vietnam when President Nixon took office. Tragically, we were losing 1,000 military service people a month. We just, after 9 years in Afghanistan, we just crossed the 1,000 mark, tragically also. But we were losing 1,000 a month when he took over. Student demonstrations across the country were disrupting campuses and communities. There were There were riots at the '68 convention, which I'm sure we all remember, in Chicago, which kind of set the tone for that campaign. And LBJ, because of the war, pulled out of the nominating process and turned it over because Gene McCarthy was making so much run, a good run for the nomination. We had assassinations that year that were tragic. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And that led to urban riots racial riots throughout the country, and just about all the racial centers. And those riots created a loss of around 50 lives in a very short period of weeks. Racial tensions were high. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June. So the country was a little bit in shock. Vietnam was standing there, and we were losing our leaders. There was disruption in our youth and disruption in our racial relations. This was a tough time. LBJ's Great Society was announced with great flourish, but it had left first it had created vast bureaucracies in Washington to make decisions for the local level, and it had left a number of issues unaddressed. The welfare mess was, as it was called frequently by the press, was creating a culture of dependency. School desegregation had been ordered by the courts, but hadn't really been undertaken. We had women's rights were coming into their own. There was the ERA Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment for Women, was being proposed for the Constitution. Native American rights, the Indian movement was taking form then. Those of us who were in the White House at the time remember well in '69 and '70 the formation of AIM, the American Indian Movement, which was a militant operation that was formed in 1968. Russell Means headed that. So the environmental issues were just coming to the fore. We were continuing to pollute our rivers, our waters, and our skies at an alarming rate. And America was just awakening to that. In 1969, when the president took office, but in the November election of '68, it was not a landslide. 43% vote. He won by 500,000 votes.
Todd, I can add a little bit to that because we were tracking every day how the polling every day on how the election was going. And Saturday, President Johnson came out and made a statement that he thought peace was at hand in Vietnam. On Sunday, Hubert Humphrey went ahead of us in our tracking polls. On Monday, President Johnson came out and sort of recanted his statement and backed off. And on Tuesday, we won the election.
Yeah, and you may recall that actually we didn't know that he had won until 11 o'clock the next morning. So
That's
it wasn't
exactly
we all
right.
went
We
to
spent
bed
the
not
whole
knowing
night
whether we had won.
tracking
With that,
that.
that's a nice transition to
Well,
move.
let me make one additional point, because politically, the president took office with both houses of Congress against him. The first newly elected president in 100 years to take office with both houses dramatically against him. So the political climate was not a walk in the park here, nor was the climate in the United States.
Right.
Right.
Larry, I think it would be, at this point, January 20th, he's sworn in 1969.
Well, actually,
what did we do?
No, on November 8th, I think it was, we realized we won the election at about 5 o'clock in the morning. I think we finally, when we were at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel that night. We immediately realized we had a whole 90 days to set up the largest corporation in the world, the United States government. And one of the first things my boss, Bob Haldeman, asked me to do was go out and find all the books that had been published on how to set up presidencies. And there were a grand total of 2. And the one that made any sense was a guy named Andy Goodpaster, who was the staff secretary during the Eisenhower administration. And basically, he had set up a government and a White House that was really focused on the cabinet. It was a cabinet-run kind of organization. You go then to President Kennedy, who just had sort of a circle of advisors around him, but no sort of real formal process. And frankly, a lot the same thing for Lyndon Johnson. Everything was wherever Lyndon Johnson went. This president wanted to get a lot of things done, had a lot of problems on his plate, as Todd clearly laid out, and it became very clear that you had to set up a different kind of White House if you were going to be successful. Probably the one thing we took from the past administrations was the National Security Council, which was an organization that worked very well on foreign policy and defense matters and this sort of thing. There was nothing that was even an equivalent to that in any prior administration On the domestic side, and clearly with the number of domestic problems and issues we wanted to deal with, we had to have some mechanism for getting that done, which led to the establishment of the Domestic Policy Council, which Todd served as the deputy on for a period of time. But this allowed us to begin to organize the initiatives we wanted to get done in the White House in a very different way. The other thing the president did is he clearly looked at the government differently. He thought decisions should be made in the White House and executed by cabinet members. Prior to that, cabinet members had each run their own fiefdom and just sort of reported in periodic meetings into the White House. So it was going to be a very different White House, one that was very White House focused in terms of decisions and actions and how we were going to get things done. The other piece that was unique was setting up what I'll call the Office of the Presidency, which was something nobody had ever thought of before. And this was an organization that Bob Haldeman really started as chief of staff to really combine all of the separate functions that usually go on in a presidency, from how you do accountability, how you track papers through a staff secretariat, how you get your speeches done, what press relations should be, what congressional relations should be. All these things coming together, particularly in terms of how you move the president, how the president spends his time, was really thought about. So you had a very different, very professional White House that was being set up to deal with the complexity of issues that Todd realized. And we had a whole 90 days to get that done. So it was a very exciting and very furious kind of period as we went into January 20th. Now, once we did that, we had to also have a government that was organized along those same kinds of lines. And that's where Fred became infinitely valuable, because Fred and his team really were the people that architected not only how the rest of the government got to be organized, but more importantly, how it got to be staffed, the kinds of professionals, really meaningful people you wanted to bring into the organization.
My
Fred,
turn?
that's you.
Well, the personnel process was a very fascinating one. In fact, Ron, I think, mentioned, or Todd, the first thing I remember about the administration, I'm just a humble tool manufacturer in Orangeburg, South Carolina, running a company. I'm 31 years old, and I tune in to television, and there's President Nixon announcing in early December his entire cabinet. Stood behind each cabinet member, talked about them, why he selected them, what their qualities were, and what he expected them to do in the new administration. It was very inspiring to me. It truly was. And little did I know that 3.5 months later, I would end up coming to Washington as the Deputy Undersecretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
Well, it was a poignant moment, too, at the Shoreham Hotel when he did that, and it was televised nationally, and it was just one of those moments I think everybody was captured by. And
Yeah, I've
it's
never
never
seen
been done
anything like
since,
it.
which is kind of interesting.
I've never seen anything quite like it. We had the whole cabinet there and pretty much in place at a very early stage. The quality was breathtaking. About 18 months later, my experience with personnel really started. I was recruited over from HEW to become the presidential assistant for White House personnel. And President Nixon's premise was that we can't just rely on the people we know, the people that have supported us politically, the people that other political leaders, senators, and governors recommend. We had to go out beyond that universe and broaden ourselves and find the best quality people in the country to come in and staff the government, because that's the only way we were going to truly be effective. Someone else would have to judge whether we're successful, but let's look at some of the merits of the people that we did have in that government and what they went on to be. Most, or I shouldn't say most, but an abundance of modern day and recent leaders in political history were a product of Richard Nixon's selection. We had future presidents, we had future vice presidents, we had future secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, secretaries of commerce. We had future Supreme Court justices, future senators, future CEOs. Let's look at a couple of those. I remember in maybe 3 months into my tenure, maybe 2 months into my tenure at White House personnel, I was meeting with the president and Bob Haldeman, and we were discussing various appointments. The president said, we have a very talented young man we recruited to run for the Senate. He lost in Texas. It was George H.W. Bush. And he said, I think we ought to make him ambassador to the United Nations. He did. He made him ambassador to the United Nations. Without Richard Nixon reaching out, there never would have been a President Bush. There never would have been a President George W. Bush. Others who were in that White House. There was a very young assistant to Don Rumsfeld. Don Rumsfeld was a counselor to the president, a very young assistant who we didn't pay much attention to at the time. His name was Dick Cheney. He went on to be Vice President of the United States. We had future Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger, of course, George Shultz, Al Haig, and my OMB executive assistant, Colin Powell. 4 Secretaries of State came out of that White House. Then you look at the future economic leadership of the country. Herb Stein was the chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors. One of his junior associates was a man named Alan Greenspan. He was in that White House. Of course, there was the speech writing staff. They didn't amount to a whole lot, but you had guys like Pat Buchanan and Bill Safire. Bill Safire, who probably was the best political columnist I've ever read, bless his soul, and David Gergen and Ray Price. I know I'm missing a lot of good people. I better take a peek at my notes here to make sure I didn't.
Hank
Oh,
Paulson.
yeah, 2 Secretaries of Treasury, Hank Paulson and Paul O'Neill. And then there's Pat Moynihan, Nino Scalia, and oh yeah, there was this young assistant in the press office. She was kind of pretty, but nobody returned her call because she's too junior. We do now. That was Diane Sawyer. But the president wasn't content just to rely on the strength of personnel. He also wanted to organize in a way that would make government effective. He had one basic premise that guided a lot of his thinking, and that is the government was too big. Sound familiar? Government is too big, too cumbersome, too unwieldy, too bureaucratic. So he coined the phrase, the new federalism. I think he coined the phrase. Right. I guess he and Moynihan did. And the idea was, let's delegate more to the states, to the cities, to the other authorities in the nation. Let's take away from the federal government. We shouldn't have that much power. We're too cumbersome. We're too unwieldy. We're too complex. Let's put more out to the states.
Well, also, Fred, on that, what was happening with the accumulating power in Washington, the decisions were being made by bureaucrats of what kind of sewer systems were going to go into San Jose. I mean, it was really, and he also believed that the level of government closest to the problem should be making the decision. And that while the federal government had this stainless steel tax machine that could accumulate money, he created the revenue sharing, which was going to push money from the federal government back to the communities and have them make the decisions, given very broad guidelines instead of specific regulations.
Exactly.
And I think that takes us to Barbara, former Secretary of Commerce, and things that she did in the White House to recruit women, and it's just as extraordinary as to what Fred talked about. And
let's talk about women. I think what President Nixon did, I'm going to give you my bottom line first, then tell you how it happened. What he did to advance women in the federal government actually served to bring equality for women, which was kind of a bra-burning, contentious movement over here in the left. He brought it right into the mainstream of American life, and that rippled through our society, changed our society. Terribly important. Now, how that happened is I think Pat Nixon was right in there, lobbying, but what happened at an early press conference is that Vera Glasser, who's a very attractive person, stood up and said, Mr. President, out of your first 200 appointments, only 3 have gone to women. And then she said something like this, I'm going to paraphrase, are we going to see more equitable representation of women, or are we going to continue to be the lost sex? And she said, the president seemed a little surprised, but then he said, we'll have to do something about that. And things started to happen after that. And then by the time we got to April of 1971, there were 3 things that happened. I mean, Fred was crucial to this, but the president sent to each cabinet secretary and agency head a request, well, not a request, I mean, it was,
directive.
You will send me an action plan about how you're going to train and advance women in your department, and I want them in a month. And then I was brought in, again, Fred recruited me to in turn recruit women for high-level jobs in government, and then Jane Spain was put at civil service to look over the career service. And we started out, it was a managerially oriented effort here, and we set a goal of doubling the number of women in these high jobs in a year. Well, by the time we got to a year, we had nearly tripled those numbers. And some of these people, in fact, most of them, in jobs women had never held, breakthroughs. And you hear names like Helen Bentley and Virginia Nauer and Catherine Bedell, and I could go on and on.
Carla Hills.
And Carla Hills and Marina Whitman,
Yeah.
yes, who went on to other things. It was a great start, and that just opened Pandora's box, and it continued. But maybe even more importantly, during this time, we had the first admirals and generals who were women. We had the first FBI agents and forest rangers and tugboat captains, these jobs that were
Park Service Rangers made a huge move on the Park Service.
Well, and that's when it happened. A lot of things like this happened, and I think it's totally escaped the American public that this is where we went. I remember one particular instance, and that has to do with the Supreme Court. In 1971, there were 2 vacancies. I had all kinds of women's groups coming to me. Liz Carpenter came with a bunch of names. I had a lot of women's groups who were angry anyway visiting me. My job was a little more than recruiting, was doing some of
Well,
this.
you were a sounding board, because I can remember them coming down the hall of the old EOB to
Ron
see
was
you.
down the hall.
Right.
Oh yeah, they're pounding on my
Yeah.
door.
And those were
Sometimes they thought you were in our offices, and we had to fend them off.
Those are the days you could just walk in and pound on the door. You didn't have to go through all kinds of security.
Well, so I got into all kinds of other issues. But anyway, we really tried hard to find women candidates for those 2 slots. And really, there just weren't enough women in the pipeline who were philosophically compatible and really qualified. However, the Justice Department was in on this, and they floated the name of a woman from actually this area, Mildred Lilly, if anybody remembers that.
Oh, yeah.
The American Bar Association took her apart. And that was kind of the end of that effort. However, the seed was planted that there would be a woman on the court, and Ronald Reagan ended up doing it 10 years later. Now, we understand also that Pat Nixon was very much for this, and that when her husband didn't appoint a woman, she let him know about it. And so we thank Pat, but bottom line here, I think President Nixon really did something of great importance in our society that started there and has just continued. And now equality
That's
is a
a great
given.
legacy moment right there.
And I'm
Bobbie,
holding,
that's a great
I want to hold up one thing. We decided, a few of us, almost 15 years ago, to try to document what happened because it's not known. So we started an oral history project. We have 50 histories from the women who were there and were appointed, some of the men who helped to make this happen. Fred and Bobbie are both in it. And it's called A Few Good Women, Advancing the Cause of Women in Government, 1969 to 74. The collection is at the Penn State Archives. It would have probably been here, but the library wasn't equipped to do that at the time. But we're linked.
We are now.
Our web is now linked. Okay. We have a book coming out to document. This is a coffee table type book. And because young people don't have a clue what happened or how it was back then, we have teaching aids that are already out, grades 6 through 12, modules that can get stuck into civics and history. So that this legacy of Richard Nixon, which I really think is important, should live on.
That's great.
Right, a couple other legacy things before you move on, if I might. What we didn't mention is the pioneering in the environment. You know, we Republicans are often looked at as not being for the environment. Well, who created the Council on Economic Quality, Council on Environmental Quality? Who created the Environmental Protection Agency? It was Richard Nixon.
Yeah, that's the first Clean Air Act, the first Clean Water
was
Act.
right then.
Who
NOAA
created
was
the Office
created.
of Management Budget, the Domestic Council, the Office of Telecommunications Policy? Richard Nixon.
Right.
Bobbie, you were instrumental with John Ehrlichman in the Domestic Council with Todd and all of that crew, but you were also very important in the development of the Native American. Among other things, but I just find that very interesting.
Yeah.
People don't know what President Nixon
No,
did.
they don't. But before we get into that, I think it is really important to understand that I personally believe, and I think probably everybody in this panel agrees, that there has been no presidency since who has brought the caliber and character of individuals to government that Richard Nixon did. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
That's true.
And that's not a partisan statement. That's Republicans or Democrats. It was really an extraordinary time with an extraordinary group of people. And 2 of those I had the privilege of working for as a White House Fellow. And my husband, Bill, was a White House Fellow, and Jeff Shepard was here, who's White House Fellows. I had the privilege of working for John Ehrlichman and Ken Cole, and they are sorry, I don't mean to cry, but they're no longer with us. But I think we all ought to recognize the wonderful job that they did and the commitment they had to America.
Good for you.
Both of them.
Well
I think
stated.
that's absolutely.
I was a very young staffer. I was a White House fellow. I was right out of law school. And so in contrast to these guys, I didn't see the President Nixon very much. I think maybe I had 5 conversations within a 22-month period. I stayed about 10 months over my White House Fellows year. But my first 5 or 6 months, I was in the staff secretariat. And therefore, I saw every piece of paper that went into the president. And then I moved over with Todd to the Domestic Policy Council, so I saw it from a different perspective, i.e. developing the policy versus moving the paper into the president. But from both of those perspectives, I came to a conclusion that Richard Nixon was, number one of the most progressive Republicans of his generation, and number 2, that he really did believe in attempting to further a just society in America. And I think people don't focus on that. They focus only on the foreign policy. But Ed Cox and I were talking on the plane this morning about a law professor of jurisprudence at Duke that the president had and what impact those discussions that the president had with this law professor about the elements of a just society. And then you think about his Quaker background and the fact that his grandparents or great-grandparents were a part of the Underground Railroad. And all of that, I think, had a major impact on him. This was looking at it from an outsider. And so I made a list, and it's not a comprehensive list, but I made a list of the domestic initiatives that I most remember. And if you look at each one of them, they are all parts of an element of a just society that enables you to have empowerment, to have choice, to have opportunity, and also to have protection for your citizens. And some of these agencies which we created have gone a little overboard over time, but nonetheless, they were clearly needed when they were created, and they still have important roles to play. And I bet there are not 40 historians who even know that he did all this. As Fred said, the Environmental Protection Agency he created, ERISA, pension reform, he laid the groundwork for, OSHA, in the Labor Department, the Protection for Workers, the first affirmative action plan in the construction trades, the Philadelphia Plan, welfare reform, HR 1, the Family Assistance Plan, negative income tax, revenue sharing, healthcare reform. We may not like HMOs now, but boy, when they were created, they were revolutionary in the sense of reforming healthcare, family health insurance plans, Native American policy, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the National Endowment of the Arts. He implemented that. That had been passed just before Johnson left office, but it had not been implemented. And he put a specific emphasis on participation in the arts and humanities by young people. He was very worried, I think, that young people were not having a broad liberal arts education. School desegregation in the South, and major increases in funding to historically black colleges so people actually had a choice, and black capitalism. And then if you take a look at Native Americans, and if you want me to, I can talk about that now, or I can wait more for Q&A, whatever you'd like.
I think it'd be interesting if you
Go ahead.
I want
Go
to
right
add
ahead.
too.
Add.
If you wanted to just, one standpoint, someone mentioned this morning about Ted Kennedy before he passed away on health care.
Healthcare.
Is that you?
Yeah, one of the things he said, I guess, a few
One of the
weeks
things
before
he
he
said
died.
was one of his biggest regrets was not supporting Nixon on health care.
Yeah.
And if we could have gotten that through the Finance Committee.
And it wouldn't be the albatross we have now.
It wouldn't be the albatross, but also, the 18-year-old vote. People forget that.
The draft.
And we
Voluntary
got rid of the
Voluntary
draft.
Army.
At the time, we were pulling in several 100,000 a year into the draft, and the 18-year-olds didn't have a vote, and the rallying cry was old enough to fight, old enough to vote. So President Nixon established the 18-year-old vote. He eliminated the draft, and we have now the all-volunteer force, which I think by any measure is the greatest fighting force the world has ever known, and has been for quite some time.
Are you done?
Well, I just one other thing going. I think the thinking behind some of his policies, both on foreign policy and domestic policy, was innovative thinking, and there was an empathy throughout on the domestic policy that people don't talk about. This president was the one who indexed Social Security to inflation.
Yep.
Well, inflation was going. We were in a wartime economy, and inflation was over 6% a year. So it was really sucking dry the elderly in this country, which relied very heavily at the time, more so than now, on Social Security. So there are a number of things that he took from principle and drove into policy and drove into politics, even with both houses against us.
Barbara, you were going to make a point?
Well, besides the women initiative, consumerism.
Yep.
came to
Right.
the forefront there, and he appointed me, and Consumer Product Safety Commission was one of the things that came into being.
Created the
during
Consumer
that
Created
period.
it.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's just one more to add to your list.
Yeah.
Larry, let's move a little bit, just for a moment's sake, on foreign policy.
Well, I think everybody, when you hear the word Nixon, the next word is China. And I think that China will be remembered for 1,000 years. But in terms of real impact upon our society and upon the world, I think you have to take a broader view than that. First of all, he had an incredible vision of the world overall, where it was headed and the issues that you had to deal with. And he put a lot of that together in what Henry Kissinger later described as the linkage theory, understanding the common needs and how people operate and how countries interact with each other to really make something happen. Probably the biggest example of that was really successful wasn't just China, but one that nobody talks about, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, or SALT talks, as we like to call them then, which was the first attempt and became successful in limiting nuclear weapons and limiting warheads in the world, and led to a complete change in terms of how the Soviet Union viewed us and how we viewed the Soviet Union. And when you combine that with what he did in Europe, plus what he did with China, you have a complete reordering of the world. Mm-hmm. And the template that got established there is how the world operates today. And I think people say, well, Reagan ended the Cold War and on and on and on. The fact of the matter is, all this got changed because the direction got changed during the Nixon administration. So we could talk about foreign policy all day, and I'm not a foreign policy expert, although I did go on all of his trips with him. But I think just that reordering really sets a very different world today than what we
Well, it
had,
was
would have
also
had.
very important with the relationship that he had with Indira Gandhi. And not only that, but Golda Meir. Those were, I mean, the Yom Kippur War. I mean, he, even at the height of the problems with Watergate and stuff, he moved right in there to help Golda Meir.
Well, if you go to that room we have here with the great leaders that he's met, I mean, he was one of the few statesmen that was able to know all of the people from World War II, when the time they came up, all the way through till they came to leading countries and really what their point of view was, and was able to deal with all of them on a totally different basis because he had known them for so long and interacted with them on so many things.
And Larry makes a great point about the original SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation talks with the Soviet Union to reduce the level of warheads on each side. I was at a luncheon in New York in Washington, where Henry Kissinger had a Q&A, and he was talking about, he was going up the next day to testify on the nuclear rock reduction that Obama had put in place with Medvedev. And Kissinger's point was he supported this, he thought it was a really good deal, but with the U.S. today, and with its relationship with Russia, there was a virtually zero chance that they would go into conflict with each other. Back in the 1970s, the probability was much higher. That first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement was huge, and it did order the psychological impact of the West and the East. And it started a cascading going down of separating as potential military adversaries, and then it ended up becoming into economic competitors. A very, very big change.
Can we talk China for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, that's a nice segue.
And this is going to be fast forward to show you how current President Nixon was, even when he was out of office. I think the China initiative is the most stunning stroke of foreign policy and now economic policy that I think I've ever seen that we will, you're right, in 1,000 years, this will still be talked about. And the relationship that was built has continued to grow over 40 years through different administrations, Democratic and Republican. And it's now one of the, well, it is the most important bilateral relationship in the world and part of the economic fabric and peace fabric that we have in the world today. And just stunning. He should be remembered for this. Fast forward 20 years to 1992. I was Secretary of Commerce. Now, while this relationship has grown, there have been some hiccups along the way. And one of them occurred in June of 1989 at Tiananmen Square when the Chinese government cracked down forcibly on the Democracy Wall movement. One of the sanctions, we placed 8 sanctions on China after that, and one of them prohibited high-level people from talking to each other, which meant that some wonderful thing called the U.S.-China Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, which was a Commerce Secretary to Commerce Secretary thing, couldn't function, and it was building business. President Bush lost the election in '92, and then he decided that I should go to China on a special mission to reconvene this entity that was moribund at that point and take away the sanction and give a gift, in effect, to the new administration. This was controversial. This mission was going to be controversial. There were people who really didn't like China a whole lot. The politics were very different then than they are now. Well, as I was about to go, we threw this mission together. There appeared a lead story in the New York Times on the front page that called this trip a boondoggle. Well, President Nixon saw that article. He called me, and he said, "See in the New York Times? Ignore it. You're doing the right thing. Go." That was reassuring. Then I asked him if he had any words of advice, and he gave me a one-liner: "Don't slobber over them."
The little rewind on China. It was interesting. When you talk about vision, actually the thought of going to China occurred in 1970. And it took him almost 2 years to put that whole thing together. And several times when Henry was supposedly going over to Paris to do peace talks, he actually was talking with the Chinese. And I'll never forget the time he came into the office and said he had to see Bob for a minute and walked out and left. I said, "Hey, I understand Henry's on his way once again to Paris." And Bob said, "No, he's going to China." I said, "You've got to be kidding me." And he said, "You're one of 4 people who know it. If anybody tells, you're going to be in really big trouble." But can you imagine the difficulty of trying to get Henry Kissinger into Pakistan, to go into China, to begin these negotiations?
Well,
And
Dick Allen tells the story that
the time that it took
when
to
that
really
time
put all
came
that
out and
together.
everything, he walked back into the office and said to Dick Allen, he said, "The president's going to go to China? This guy's crazy." Henry was the one that was crazy.
Well,
But
wait
that's-
a minute. We
Didn't
need
you
to
advance it?
Well, you
we
were
need
there
to
for
say
6
something
months.
about Ron Walker, who
Tell us those
advanced, that trip when there was nothing there, no communication activity, no diplomatic relations. Why don't you tell a story about that?
Well, Dwight could help me on that. It was probably the toughest advance I ever did. I mean, we arrived with 100 men, had no embassy. We took a Xerox in. We took a suitcase satellite in that the Chinese could not fathom what it was like. They wouldn't let us hook it up. I had to drive for the first 4 days out to the C-141 at the airport, which was about an hour's drive, to be able to talk to Dwight in the morning and then in the evening. 4 days into this, still trying to get the suitcase satellite, we had an incident at 1 o'clock in the morning. One of the chief warrant officers in the communications came flying into and he was an African-American, and all I could see was his white T-shirt, white pants, and his white eyes, and he said the hotel was on fire. I got up, and there was smoke everywhere. Mike Schroth, one of our other advanced men, was in the other room, and I said, "Mike, we've got to get that suitcase satellite." So I went running down the hall, and as I'm going down, there are Chinese coming down, and there's a water hose that are going down, and water's coming out of every one of these hoses. I mean, they hadn't used that hose since the hotel was built. So I got back, got the suitcase satellite, came back, went to the fire escape to get out, and the fire escape was chained. I took the suitcase, tore the door down, and as we got into the hallway, it was stored with chairs and tables, and we had to work our way to try and get out of that hotel. It started in one room. It was one of the Hughes satellite. You have to realize China had never, the largest delegation they had ever had in their 25 years since the Great March was one from Pakistan, and there were 30 people in that, and we're bringing 300 and plus. But it was an interesting.
Which hotel were you at, Ron?
It was the Hotel of the Nationalities.
We,
You own it now?
we have several hotel ventures in China now, and I go there frequently. And in fact, we have an association, a partnership with the largest hotel company in China, Jingjiang. And this is where the celebratory dinner, I believe the first treaty was signed in the Xinjiang
That's
Hotel.
correct.
But the point I wanted to make is, you go over there today and you talk to the Chinese people and you say you worked for Richard Nixon, you're on a pedestal. He is revered over there. Tricia and son and Ed's son, Chris, is running for the Congress in Long Island. If he went over to China and they had elections and he ran for us, he'd win in a landslide.
He'd be elected.
Ron, can I use that? Ron, can I use that as a segue to go back to domestic policy for a second?
Sure, absolutely.
Talking about a place where President Nixon is revered, and that is among the Native American, the Pueblo Indians in northern New Mexico. No demographer can ever figure out why it is that there's this pocket in northern New Mexico, and come heck or high water, they vote Republican every time, and that is because of Richard Nixon. And it goes back to also, you talked about the SALT Treaty and his focus on foreign policy, but he also, it seems to me, had a streak of stubbornness in him, that if he thought something was right, even if it was going to have an impact on something else he thought was important, he would stick with it on a matter of principle, and that goes back to Native Americans as well. The president had a coach when he played, I guess Ed said it was fourth string football at Whittier, but they let him go in every once in a while for some plays. And he had a coach named Coach Newman, who was Native American. And in one of the few conversations I had with him, he looked me in the eye and he said, Bobbie, he said, that coach should have been coaching in the big, what do you call it? I'm not a football person.
NFL.
Top 10, NFL, whatever, top 10 in the college. And he couldn't because he was Native American. He was discriminated against, and that's wrong. And he said, and the policy that we have towards Native Americans is paternalistic and is wrong and is preventing them from having the opportunities everyone else had, and I am going to do something about it. And he did, and and it was in a way a variation of the new federalism. And I'm going to go through that just very quickly, but then I want to focus on Blue Lake, which is something he's known for particularly, and which affected foreign policy in some interesting ways. But what the president basically said was that we wanted to have self-determination without termination. That meant without ending the special trusteeship relationship that we had, that the Native American tribes have with the federal government. But he wanted to be able to give people an opportunity without forcing them to be assimilated into the broader Anglo society, if you will, if they did not want to. If they wanted to, that was fine, but he believed in self-determination. He believed in the right, and he put all this in legislation, the right of Indians tribes to contract, to control, and operate federal programs. He was determined to do something about Indian education. The average number of school years that an Indian child had in 1970 was 6, and they were dropping out 2 times the national average from high school. He put in a number of proposals to improve economic development, both in urban Indians and in tribal reservation entities. He did a major Indian health care initiative. The average death age of Native American men and women was in 1970 44 years old. Ooh. He established an Indian Trust Council Authority, which was very controversial, and Jeff will remember this. He believed that independent of the Justice Department and the Interior Department, the Indians had the right to have independent legal representation when they were seeking to protect their natural resources rights. And he eventually made a very major settlement that enabled us, indeed, to have oil come flowing from Alaska and the Alaska Native land claims. But I want to talk about Blue Lake. Blue Lake was something that caught the president's attention, and his determination and his spirit and his just emotion. It was a lake sacred to the Taos Pueblo people, without which they could not practice their religion. And they had 48,000 acres of land around it in a watershed. That land had been taken from them unfairly and unjustly 64 years before and had been put in a national forest. Thank you very much. And they desperately wanted it back. The president said that land belongs to them. They need to have it back. There was absolutely no, as there was with all the other measures of the Indian policy, there was absolutely no political gain for him in doing any of this. The Western states didn't like the Indian message. They didn't like the concept of turning anything back to the Native American people. But he did it anyway because it was right. One particular senator, Clinton Anderson, this is in New Mexico, by the way. One particular senator, Clinton Anderson, was very senior. He was a Democrat. He was on the Foreign Relations Committee. And I was taking this message, the day it was actually delivered was July 8th, 1970, but I was taking it about 2 weeks before that to the press room to be released. And I was literally tackled by a wonderful guy named Ken Ballou, who was head of the president's Senate legislative team. And he literally pinned me against the wall and says, you cannot, all the papers flew up in the air and said, you are not releasing that. And I said, why? He said, because Senator Anderson, Clinton Anderson, is going to vote against the ABM treaty if this goes forward. And I said, you got to be kidding me. He said, I'm not kidding you. And he turned around, he kind of pushed me towards the Oval Office, and he called up in the outside office, I don't know if that was where you were, and he said to John Ehrlichman, you better get down here. And John Ehrlichman went down there, and I wasn't allowed to go in the Oval Office, but John Ehrlichman and Ken Ballou went in the Oval Office. They turned around and came back, and John had this big smile on his face, and Ken looked like he'd been hit with a ton of bricks. And I said, what happened? He said, the president said that Clinton Anderson can go, we are going to have Blue Lake. And he did, and Clinton Anderson voted against the ABM treaty. But the president believed in this firmly. It was the first time that, I guess those of you who know congressional relations better than I do, in those days when a committee voted on something, that was it. The Senate Interior Committee had voted against return to Blue Lake. The president looked at us and said, go up there and turn that around. And we did. We overturned a Senate committee, which had never, ever happened before. And then it was a very interesting bipartisan coalition. I mean, everybody says, oh, the President Nixon couldn't work with Democrats. The coalition was Richard Nixon, Senator Fred Harris, a Democrat from Oklahoma, his wife, LaDonna Harris, a Comanche Indian from Oklahoma, and Ted Kennedy. They were the oddest quartet I have ever seen, but they were extraordinarily effective. And when we signed the bill on December 15th, 1970, again, I was this young kid, this was my first signing ceremony, and the president sat, and this is in the East Room, and he sat at the table, and the cacique, who's the old religious leader, must have been 96 years old at that point, stood there next to the tribal secretary, a guy named Paul Bernal. And it was this ceremony, and the cacique would say maybe 10 words, and then Paul would translate for about 10 minutes in English. And the president was sitting there, and I went, oh gosh, I'm gonna be fired, I know this. And he just sat there, and he looked totally attentive and totally inspired, and he signed the bill, and we had lots of other pleasantries, and then he said, walk with me, and I thought, you know, he's never asked me to do that before. So I started walking down the colonnade, and he said, you know, he said, I'm really late for my next appointment. I'm supposed to be at HUD, and I have 1,000 people waiting for me. And I went, I'm sorry. He said, no, never be sorry. He said, that was the most wonderful ceremony I've ever participated in. He said, those people deserve to have the ability to celebrate and practice their religion, and I am proud that our White House made that happen. And I just was, I mean, it was overwhelming. And there's a humanism to Richard Nixon that I think people don't see and understand, but he would stand up for what he believed was right.
I have a follow-on to that because while director of the National Park Service, any number of Native Americans have since been brought into the ranger ranks, and Blue Lake was part of the United States Forest Service, not the Park Service, thank you.
I'm sorry.
But I've had any number. There was one individual that was a fifth-generation Cherokee, John Cook, who's now mayor of Page, Arizona, that when I became president of the foundation, wrote me a note and said, I want you to know I'm a Democrat, but I think Richard Nixon did more for the Native American than any other president in the history of the country.
He did.
You know, he also did a lot. He also pioneered, in addition to women, recruiting of Hispanics to high-level positions in government. And he was very successful. I think the head of the SBA. The one that I most poignantly remember is this one, though. He called me in one day and he said, we need more women of Hispanic, we need more people of Hispanic heritage, and we need more women of Hispanic heritage in this administration. Here's an opening, high-level position at the Department of Treasury, the Treasury of the United States. I want you to find me a qualified woman. Yes, sir. So we went out and I got a couple of my recruiters together and we started looking for a qualified woman to be the Treasurer of the United States. And lo and behold, we found out that we had a woman named Ramona Banuelos from California, right near here. Ramona Banuelos ran a big food company. She had started, she had built it up. It went big, it was maybe 10, 12 million of revenue, but a very successful businesswoman who had built this business. So we thought we had really struck gold, and we had actually. And we went in, we recommended Ramona Banuelos to the president, and he nominated her. This is a position that has to be confirmed. Well, after that great victory, Marlene and I got in our car and we drove across country to Illinois to my brother's wedding. On the way there, unbeknownst to me, state troopers all over the states between Washington and Illinois are looking for me. And it's Bob Haldeman on the phone saying, did you realize that they just raided her plant and they've got all these illegal aliens there?
Well, they were all Democrats, we thought.
But,
Well,
but nevertheless, she was treasurer, and she did a good job, really good job.
in fairness here, Bill Maramoto, who's no longer with us,
Yes.
was the minority recruiter.
Yes.
And he was working on the Hispanic side. I got into it, but really I would credit Mo and Fred. We have Romana Banuelos in our oral history series. And I have to say something also about minorities and the whole women effort. We really focused on minorities as well, Hispanic and African American and whatever else. And we were fairly successful on that too, which I think is sort of escapes recognition. And
Well, one of the most prominent African Americans was Bob Brown.
Well, yeah.
Who was just elected to the Nixon Center board.
You know, just sort of tying all that together, I mean, what Fred did and Barbara and all the recruiting and stuff, there was a real different feeling in the country then. Executives who were making a ton of money would leave and come and serve.
Oh, good point.
People, I mean, I'll never forget when the first week we were in the White House, we were setting up the White House staff. Well, you know, these people do have to be paid something, you know. It's not cheap to live in Washington, D.C. And I was absolutely struck by how many top-level people, like Bob Haldeman, Henry Kissinger, and these guys that were in the White House staff, were making $28,000 a year. That was their salary. Now, the most they ever made the whole time they were there was $42,000 a year. That was the high watermark. So you can imagine all of the people who came who made less than that. But they came to serve, and I think it was because the president really had put a culture together that suggested service to this country being great. When you see as you walk in out here in the exhibit singing God Bless America, and there was a genuine feeling that he created like that. Of service.
We've lost some of that. And the other thing that was in play there, and why what he did to advance women created this climate in which a bunch of other things happened, like Title IX, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission got more power, and you could name a whole series of things. Government was a model then, a model that states wanted to follow and that the private sector wanted to emulate. Somehow, and I give him credit, but somehow we've lost that in this country, and I think
I think we can blame
bad.
part of the confirmation process on that too. I mean, and we were able to get a number of people who came into the cabinet and sub-cabinet that Fred recruited that were going to make 10 and 15% from their government salaries what they were in private with law firms and companies. And they took that sacrifice to come in and serve. And they got confirmed and they served. And nowadays, the confirmation process is so difficult and ugly. And if you're an executive or a lawyer or something like coming in, you get really hammered.
Well, and also
it's very expensive.
The
ability
ability
to
to say no.
You just
and
say
you
no.
also, you can't make a living when you leave.
Right.
Because everything is you can't do this,
Well,
you
the
can't do that, you
confirmation
can't do
process,
this.
just the financial, I mean, it's thousands of dollars for some of these individuals just to do the paperwork.
Right.
Right.
Oh,
Okay,
no
well,
question.
it's just-
Right. I
And-
talked to somebody who took a senior job, economic job in the Bush administration, who was a prominent financier. He took the job eventually. He spent over $1 million of legal fees getting all the papers in order to do everything he had to do in order to take that job. But by the way, you remember, we had very few turndowns. Very few people we offered jobs to take 10% or 15% of what they were making. Very few people turned us down. I bet you 3 out of 4 accepted it when we made an offer.
Well, there was a different ethic.
Well,
Very
and there was
different,
a,
very
given the
different.
tone that was in the country at the time, which was hostile, and we were in a
difficult.
war, and we were having racial problems, and crime rates, and high inflation, to have those kinds of people not say no, but come and serve. I mean, it was really, it was a patriotic thing to do, and there was an honor to it. Now it's you
And they
wonder-
didn't leave and turn around and immediately write a book either.
Right.
No.
Yeah, well, that's-
No, that ethic has changed too.
And
You know, we've got about 5 more minutes,
Okay.
and I'd like to take that 5 minutes and have each of you, in your own way, how should President Richard Nixon be remembered? Todd, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do. But clearly, China and the SALT talks on the foreign side, I think, are going to be preeminent. I think legacies are things that presidential legacies are things that presidents do that last for generations. And I think I was recently talking at this forum here with Bill Ruckelshaus, and I think on the environmental side, Bill made the comment, who was the first director of EPA, made the comment that Richard Nixon's environmental policies touched every American and improved their lives forever. That's a very big deal.
Powerful.
So it's very powerful. And I think when you combine the things he did on the minorities, for black colleges, and for senior citizens, the whole, his empathetic work on and changing policies to work for those disadvantaged, I think that's where he should get credit, and we have, as a foundation and those who have served, need to work on that, because that's getting put aside. I think now that we're 40 years after this, and the hysteria is down, even though the country is more divided right and left than before, we have a chance to lower the tone and look at the substance. And I think on the environment, he was innovative on health care. His health care bill was really sensational. His welfare bill was one that had work incentives and didn't penalize work and helped the working poor, set a national income floor, got it through the House, did not get it through the Senate. It later became law under Bill Clinton, with a Republican Congress, by the way. His innovation, he set the mark that other presidents and other administrations accomplished, but he did the thought process, and he and his team put together some really innovative, far-reaching, long-lasting things that made this country better on the domestic front.
Well stated. Barbara?
I can't really improve on that, but I'd like to see his vision in a number of arenas, both the domestic, and I mean the women thing is just a piece of that, but the foreign policy piece also. The vision and then the implementation, the execution of actions that made the vision a reality. And we haven't seen quite the likes of that since, and I'd like to see all of that recognized. Plus, I think the empathetic side, which has come out here as we've been talking here. I think all of these things need to come to the fore.
Larry?
Well, I think they've all said it very well. I guess from my standpoint, I think the one thing we forget, this was a bipartisan president. He had a Democratic Congress practically the whole time he was here, yet he passed amazing amounts of legislation, got the country through a war, and successfully concluded it, and did a number of things on the foreign policy scale that'll last for a lifetime. I thought one of the most interesting, sort of picking up on the theme of bipartisan, that I heard was when Bill Clinton was out here and actually gave one of the eulogies at the president's funeral. And he talked about, I think the quote was, I won't get it exactly right, but it's time that the American people realize the fullness of his contribution and all that he made. And I think as the rancor...
Fullness of his life is what he basically
the rancor of the 60s and pro-Vietnam, anti-Vietnam, all this sort of stuff sort of goes by, and people begin to take a much more scholarly and objective look at his presidency and at his life. I think you're going to find one of the truly extraordinary people that ever walked this earth.
If I might insert just on what you said on Vietnam. As I mentioned earlier, there were 550,000 troops at the time he took office. In May 1972, there were 70,000. That's a massive de-escalation. All combat elements had ended. Richard Cohen, from Washington Post columnist, wrote a column a few weeks ago where he talked about, Nixon massively de-escalated, ended combat operations, and did all these different things on Vietnam, and were all the protesters outside, talking about his magnificent peace efforts? No, they were still anti-war. But he made amazing progress in what we called then Vietnamization, which is what basically is happening in Iraq, and eventually at some point will happen in Afghanistan.
Bobbie?
Back on the domestic side, a progressive innovator who furthered the concept of a just society.
Well stated.
Good.
It's hard to add to all of that, but let me try. He dealt with the Democratic Congress. He was one of the most intelligent, visionary men, women we've ever had in office. But he dealt with the Democratic Congress, and he got all these things done. He wasn't what you would call a hail fellow, well-met people person. He was a serious, serious guy. But yet, somehow or another, he was able to bring people of both parties, senators and congressmen of both parties together, and forge consensus and get things done. It doesn't just happen. You can't just dictate when you're in the Oval Office. You need to build consensus. And he was able to do it. And it was a great model for what I think present day chief executives could learn a lot from.
He did not grandstand. When you don't grandstand, you can get things done. The
And
present
if-
administration should maybe learn.
In the '72 reelection, after the squeak through. Yeah. After the very close election in '68, please remember the '72 election was one of the greatest landslides
That's
in
right.
presidential history. So,
It
in
was.
terms, real progress had been made, and the American public noticed. We need to do that again.
Ladies and gentlemen,
That's
it's
what we need to do.
one more notch in the Nixon legacy. And if we can get this message out, maybe one day he'll be appreciated like we do. God bless you, and thank you, panel.